In this video, we're going to examine the postback process and kind of bring together the concepts of utilizing our view models, utilizing our HTTP verb actions, as well as how to actually manage and deploy a postback. So actually creating a form within an HTML document and then being able to fill out that form and then post that data back and getting it processed by the server. So to kind of help along with this video lecture, I've gone ahead and pre-created the HTML document, but I do want to walk through and kind of discuss what we're seeing here. So you'll notice that this is a modified version of the view that we've used in previous lectures, and this is a strongly typed view, so we're using the user view model. Then I have basically two sections. I have a input section and I have an output section. In the input section, I'm using this line of razor/C# code to generate a form. We'll talk about this in greater detail next week, but the idea here is that we're basically creating a form tag using this line of code. Then inside of that form, which is designated by the curly brackets, we have input parameters or input controls or tags, and they're named the same as we were naming our query string parameters previously. So you'll see that there's a correlation. Here's first name, last name, email, and password, and those are the four properties off of our view model: first name, last name, email, and password. Those name alignments are intentional, and they need to be that way in order for the model binder to be able to pick up the value from the text box and bind it to the view model. Let me say that one more time. The names are intentional and they have to match in order for the model binder to pick up the value from the text box. And this will be the first name text box, the last name text box, the email text box, and password text box, and be able to map and load them into the appropriate properties inside of our view model. Alright, so we also have a submit button to actually submit our form. And then I have below that our output. So the idea is that this form will load, we'll get these text boxes and be able to type in values and then hit submit. And then upon submit, those values will get sent back to our controller. They'll get picked up as what's called a postback or an HTTP post. And then those values will then get presented in this lower section called the output. Now, I'm doing an if statement to say if the model does not equal null, meaning if there is a view model passed, then we are going to take those values of first name, last name, and email and password and output them onto the screen. So basically you fill out the form, you hit submit, and then those values show up underneath the form as just regular HTML. Now, in order for this to work, we actually have to have both an HTTP GET and an HTTP POST within our controller. Both of them are aligned or mapped to the index action, but they're handling different types of HTTP verbs. So our default is our HTTP GET, which is an index and view. Now, upon GET, we're simply loading up the form. We're not actually going to be processing any data, so there is no input parameters. It's just a standard GET for the page, and then we're not passing any models because we have no model data to pass. So we'll just leave that as a kind of a standard HTTP GET action. Below that, however, we need to add an HTTP POST action, and that action will start out by just simply copying the action signature from above. So they look almost identical. If you were to run them and then hit the submit button, they would do the exact same thing. There is no difference here except for one handles the gets and one handles the posts. Now the thing that we do want to do is we want to add to this action an input parameter of user view model. And that input parameter will then be taken and passed back to the view as the view model, which will then get processed as output values. So the idea here is that when this form is submitted, these values from these text boxes get bound upon form submission or upon post to this view model. That view model will pick up those values, the model binding will occur, and then the model will get passed back to the view, and the view will pick up those model values and then output them below just as regular HTML. So let's go ahead and build this. F6 and F5 to run and see what happens. So our form comes up the first time. This is handled by our HTTP GET action, which simply just returns the view. This little bit of logic will execute. Since there is no model, this actually will not get rendered out at all. So there's just a blank div tag located inside of here. If we actually look at the view source, we'll see that here's our input. Here's the div tag that surrounds that. Here's that form that I was talking about. And you'll see there's a method of post. So it's posting back to home/index. Here's our labels and our text boxes and our submit button. And then we close form, close div, and then here's that secondary div, but you'll notice that in our template we have an if statement in here. Well, that if statement is false, therefore we get nothing in the resulting view. So if we come back to the form, and we'll fill this out, Kevin, Gantos, Gantoka, password, and I made this a text field just for clarity, but typically a password field would actually be of password type, not text. So we'll go ahead and we'll hit submit, and let me actually put a breakpoint here on our controller so we can see what's happening. And I'll hit submit. The submit will do a form post, and that's why this action picks up that post. We mouse over model and expand it, and we'll see all of our values in here from our form. We then are taking that model in its entirety with all of its values, and we're shipping them back to the view. I can actually put a breakpoint here in the view and hit continue, and continue, there we go. And we can see that our model in fact has those values. So the values from our form went to the controller did the model binding, brought in those parameters. We then took that view model, our user view model, and passed it to the view, at which point we can pick that up inside the view with its values and then output them to the screen. We hit continue again, and we now have first name, last name, but there's actually a typo in my view because I have first name twice, so I got Kevin, Gantoka at ucmail.uc.edu is my email address, and then our password of password. Now, since I have a typo in my view, I can come back here and say last name, simply save it. I'm still in debug, I'm still actively debugging. There's no need for me to do a rebuild, but if I come in here again and I'll fill out at apple.com with a password. Now I'm changing the name, but hopefully you can follow along that the first name should end up as the first name, the last name, and we're just resubmitting that form again to go through the cycle. We'll hit submit. Our view model will get processed. We then have our model data with Steve Jobs, and we'll process through that. And now it's Steve Jobs as the last name, Steve at apple.com, and then the password of password. So we've now taken a form, we've filled out the values in the form, we've hit submit. Just using standard HTML, we've then submitted that form back to the server, at which point it's picked up by our controller. Those values are model bound into our user view model parameter. They get mapped to the individual properties. We then pick up that model inside of our view, and then we actually can output those model values onto our page. Now, if you think of this in a more strategic or more kind of real-world example, we would actually, from our Postback form, we would actually take those user view model values, and we may do things such as authenticate someone against a database, or save those values to a database, or we could generate and send an email to that user. There's a lot of things that we could do from within these actions now, because we're getting input in, and then we're able to act on that input. So we'll get into more of that in our future lectures, but hopefully that gives you an understanding of those dynamics and how those pieces of code work together.